So, a few weeks ago, I did a video on why being a knight in a fantasy setting would suck. And someone commented, well, that's why you have ways to adapt the knights, right? You got different abilities added to them. And yes, that is true. However, when I did the video, I specifically mentioned being a medieval knight, which had nothing to do with a fantasy knight. The two are completely different things. A medieval knight, just take one out of Europe. They normally were a noble. They had a noble title. They had to have an immense wealth to be able to afford the armor that they wore in the first place. This was exceptional armor. You had to bludgeon these guys to death because you couldn't shoot an arrow through it. An arrow wouldn't have a chance unless it was a specialty arrow or within like 20 to 30 feet, right? Okay, and even a specialty arrow had to be within really close range to have a chance. But they had their war horses that were more often, especially in late period, armored. They had their weapons, their lances, oftentimes battle axe or flail. They had swords, but those were more sidearms than anything. They were not their primary weapons. And it's important to specify, another note about this armor is it was good enough that early firearms had a very difficult time getting through, unless you were talking about cannons. Like original arquebuses or muskets, it was very difficult to actually get through this armor. The knights in fantasy settings oftentimes are completely different. Yes, they still have the main armor, right? Like they have that heavy armor, heavy plate mail. But oftentimes the entire settings of how they're there are completely different. Maybe not nobles. Like that's definitely differs heavily depending on what setting you are looking at. Oftentimes they're just people trained in a specific fighting style. How they are on the battlefield, their use, their entire purpose, it's often completely different, again, on how you find knights actually behave on the battlefield historically. And of course, it has to be. You're talking about a freaking fantasy setting with wizards. They're gonna be different. That's gonna change the entire aspect of warfare. But again, the entire point of the original video was why being a medieval knight in a fantasy setting would suck. Not any type of fantasy knight. But I wasn't talking about those adaptations or the abilities. If you picked a guy out of Germany or France or England and you stuck him on a magical battlefield, they would die. That was the entire point.